Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's lecture. Our topic tonight is documenting from oral traditions and will be taught by Lord Kallinikos. Our class is going to provide an overview of different types of oral traditions and how to document their use in the SCA. Tonight's lecture is part of the Huapahua Period America lecture series, which is a monthly series that promotes the study of North, South, and Central American cultures within the SCA period. The lecture series is a continuation of the original Wapawa New World Symposiums, which started during the pandemic and have over their lifetime hosted 40 instructors and welcomed more than 700 students from every kingdom in the known world. If this is your first time with us, of course, welcome. If you've never seen one of our previous lectures are all available on our YouTube channel, and we welcome you to visit those and give feedback to all of our previous instructors. As always, I do have a couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. Of course, as you heard, the lecture is being recorded, so we'll ask that all of our attendees either raise their hand and wait for the instructor to call on them, or leave a comment or question in the chat for him to review later. This will just keep the recording nice and clean for those who aren't able to join us. Secondly, in joining our lecture tonight and in participating in any Wapawa sponsored event, you are agreeing to our zero tolerance policy for racism, xenophobia, colorism, and other forms of discrimination. If you have concerns about any attendee or teacher, I hope that you would feel safe in reaching out to me. I'm going to have my email address in the chat so you can privately contact me if there are any problems. Thirdly, we are always looking for additional instructors for months to come. If you have any topic that you would like to teach about within that North Central, and South American culture group, please reach out to me. Again, I'm going to put that email in the chat. I'm also very happy to announce that we do have our August lecture scheduled. That will be on August 5th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. The class is going to be taught by Viscountess Elsie Hoenevalk on the topic of horses in the Americas. She's going to be discussing the evolution, dispersal, and reintroduction of horses to the Americas, as well as the roles that horses played in the colonization of Meso and South America. So I want to thank you guys all again for attending the lecture, showing support for our teachers and all their hard work. I'm going to turn it over now to Lord Kallinikos so that he can get started on his class.
Thank you, Isma. And so to briefly introduce myself, my name is Kallinikos Gavras, also known as Nick Holsey Lopez, and I am from the Middle Kingdom. Modernly, I'm outside of St. Louis, Illinois, and this class is documenting from oral traditions. I have a quote from the Sundiata, which is a epic tale from West Africa, the sort of like that's similar to the Odyssey in its cultural relevance. Just kind of a quote from one of their bards, Mamdu Koyote, talking about his role in society and how important he sees his role to the memory of the people of Mali. Now, a few disclaimers before we get started. So, first of all, oral history as a source in the essay is extremely new. I believe um, the board only officially put out something about allowing oral history, I think, 2 or 3 years ago. Rules, precedents, expectations, we're still figuring this out. Everything that I say here might change over time as we get a better idea of what we're doing. I'd like to think of this class as the first the first attempt that somebody has made to really codify oral tradition in the SCA. And second of all, and this is, I believe, even more important, so a lot of the cultures we're talking about have long histories of colonialist cultures trying to erase their history, trying to denigrate it, trying to, make it irrelevant in whatever way. There's a lot of cultural pain, a lot of cultural memory that people are sensitive about. This class is going to talk to you about the mechanics and how to use these things in an SCA context. That doesn't I make no value judgment as to when it is the right time to use these things, or uh, you know whether or not it's appropriate given any particular situation. Listen to modern cultural representatives about what they consider appropriate, and make sure you are being respectful if the culture is not your own. That's good advice in general, but it is especially important for a subject like this. All right, so let's get into the fun stuff. Rules. Also, before I get started, I monitor the chat in my second monitor because I am a cool kid like that. So if you post a question in chat or use the raise hand emoji or you physically raise your hand, I will be able to see it and I'll call as soon as there's a break in the lecture. So, rules. So, July 2022, the board puts out this resolution. Whereas some historical cultures are based on oral traditions, and whereas some historical cultures have lost historical documentation due to environmental and human intervention, and whereas many historical cultures existed outside of the European sphere, the board of directors does hereby direct all officers whose area of influence would be naturally affected by this directive. In practice, that mostly meant the heralds and ANS ministers to develop a protocol for the full recognition and approval of aspects of cultures not based wholly on written documentation, but sufficiently shown to be in existence during the period covered under SCA guidelines. Now, this leads to questions like, you know, how is sufficiently shown? And that's the kind of question I'm here to try to answer. Now, one other thing going forward, I did originally make this as a heraldry class. By background and inclination, I am a herald, but I think there's a lot of it, and I've tried to expand it to be applicable in other areas as well. And so after this came out, the kingdom or the Society Minister of Art and Science sent out a guideline to the various kingdoms. Above all, be courteous and respectful, as I mentioned. They talk about specifying provenance, the when and where, evidence that the oral tradition existed prior to the 17th century, to consider context and consistency with known archaeological records or possibly corroborated by traditions of the neighbors. Again, good start, but if you're looking at this and you don't have a background in archaeology or anthropology, and I sure don't, this is maybe less helpful than it could be. And this is what SINA, the SCA rule set, says, that a submission must be reasonably period, and that the burden of proof of burden proof is on the submitter to demonstrate that it does meet the standards. But reasonably period is the important part here, since even with modern record or even with historical records that are written down, it is not always easy to prove beyond any doubt that it is accurate to pre 1600. All right, any questions before we go forward now that I've gotten all of that out of the way? Nope, fantastic. So the big question, this comes up any time that you are discussing this topic, and this is regardless of what the board of directors or anybody says. People ask, are oral traditions reliable? And the answer is they're about as reliable as written records, which means it varies a lot depending on time, place, and a million other factors. That said, we do know that oral traditions can be reliable. We have evidence, some quite impressive evidence showing that oral traditions are a reliable way to pass down information, sometimes for centuries or even millennia. We have traditions from Australia that recorded what areas were flooded at the end of the Ice Age, which is an unimaginably long time for records to be passed down. Aboriginal tribes people were able to point to specific areas in the ocean and say there used to be a kangaroo hunting ground there. Researcher James Fox, who actually went to study palm trees, was able to corroborate records in the Indonesian, upper crust of the island of Roti, and he compared the oral genealogies to records of the Dutch East India Company all the way back to 1662, and almost impressively 1-to-1, very high level of fidelity there. And there's other things that people thought weren't even real until the science proved the oral tradition right. For instance, the Klickitat tribe in Oregon used to say that they said there used to be a natural bridge over Cascadia Gorge, which seemed fantastical and not very realistic. And later geologists found out this was true. So oral traditions are not unreliable, at least not inherently, not intrinsically. And all the issues that written records have, they also have many issues. So now this leads to the question, how do people pass down these things for, sometimes thousands of years? One of the most useful things we see is what is called scaffolding and trains of transmission. So, as one of the linguists studying in Australia recorded, say I'm a man from Central Australia. My father teaches me stories about my country. My sister's children, my nephews and nieces, are explicitly tasked with kin-based responsibility for ensuring I know these stories properly. They take these responsibilities seriously. And I think sometimes, especially in modern culture, we think of the role of a storyteller purely to tell somebody a story they don't know, or to tell them something interesting or new or novel. For many times when these records were being passed down, it wasn't just to entertain or to, amuse or to present novelty. It was to make sure that if tradition was being passed down reliably. So there was a high level of fact checking going on by every other person who knew the story. Meanwhile, or uh, in another example of this, Heinrich Rink, who worked closely with the Inuit in Greenland, talked about how the ancient tales had to be nearly word to word reliably passed down in the words of the original version, with only a few arbitrary reiterations, because every other person around there knew the story and would correct them. So I think that sometimes challenges our view of individual knowledge because this was community knowledge. And the community felt responsible for making sure the knowledge was passed down reliably. Now, this leads us to particular sources. So here are, as far as I can tell, some ways to tell that a source might be good. Now, most of the time, the sources, not always, most of the time, the sources we are dealing with have at some point in their transmission been written down. So if not, you are the one who's writing down or recording it in whatever fashion. So was a source recorded closely after cultural contact? We do know that, stories from colonizing cultures would work in and sometimes modify or corrupt or just be incorporated into traditional stories. So that is something that happens. Is there a clear chain of transmission, either individually that has been recorded or a cultural tradition of having these clear scaffolded chains of transmission? Are there more than one independent recording and do they line up? And also, did the person who recorded the source, did they change it? It is not unheard of, especially, in the 18 and 1900s for anthropologists or other people to edit traditional oral traditions for their own reasons. What makes the source less good? If we don't really know the chain of transmission, we don't really know where it came from, if it's light on details of when or where or who recorded it, and also if it doesn't match other evidence. Any questions before we go on? All right, so I'm going to go over a few examples of cultural epics, of oral sources. The first we have are cultural epics. I already mentioned the Sundiata in Mali. We have things like the Darangun in the Philippines, the Great Law of the Iroquois. The Iliad was passed down for a long time before it was recorded, recorded on paper. And these cultural epics, often there is some sort of professional storytelling class or profession or clan who's responsible for these kinds of long form stories. Often we have several existing transcripts. And also, since they are so long, there's a lot of evidence in them. Now, on the other hand, the stories might be allegorical. They may not be, they may not always be meant to be taken literally. There might be different versions of them. And when it comes to documenting names, the names might not be one that people use because of cultural significance. If I walked around saying my name was Achilles, people might think I'm being a bit pretentious. So something to keep in mind there. Also, cultural epics can also just be an interesting way to get a better view of the culture overall, and I recommend reading them when you can. And so from the Darangan, the Philippine epic I mentioned, we first, after the request had been made by Aya Pagane, um, there was known a suggestion by Endingen Kilaman, and so we see names. We see them talking about the instruments like the kolintang and the babandir and the debakan. So we know that these were things that people were instruments they were playing in some form when this was written down. We have an idea what their names look like. We have an idea of what was important to them culturally. And even though this was only recorded after 1650, which is our usual cutoff, the information is there. Now we have what I, for lack of a term, call ethnographic recordings. This refers to oral traditions and folk tales, kind of, loose or not in some cohesive epic or story that were recorded by anthropologists or by members of the culture. That a lot of times this might be the only period historical data we have for a culture. Often they have several kinds of stories in it, and a lot of these were made relatively recently, for better and for worse. That said, we don't always know if it was an allegorical or historical story. We don't know if the person who wrote it down had their own biases. They wanted to make it to seem more Christian or something. And if you're trying to date these specifically, it can be hard to tell whether they came from 1500 or 1700 if contact was made after that period. Now, that said, there are ways to date it. We actually have records from the Inuit of Greenland of them interacting with the Norse Greenland settlers. They even mention name Ungortok, which we think was Ingvar, a very common Viking name. So sometimes these stories have a lot of useful historical information in them. And of course, we have oral, genealogical, and renal records. Great if you're looking for names. Often well attested. These they were taken very seriously and passed down. And you can even create a chronology out of them by doing a rough count of how long people live or how long they reigned if it's a king's list. That said, sometimes there are conflicting versions of the list. Sometimes the people in the list are legendary, not to be assumed to be real people. This is also an issue we have with written down king and regnal lists. There's plenty of, legendary kings of Japan or legendary kings of Mesopotamia. And if it's a royal name, it might have their own rules for it. And this is a genealogy from the ruling chiefs of Hawaii, which goes down quite, I think, all the way to the settlement of Hawaii. So if somebody ever wants to try to register a Hawaiian name, we have resources to do it. Any questions about sources before we go on? So that leads to the question is how do we date a oral tradition? How do we match it up to the calendar they were used to using? So the first question is, you know, is the record corroborated by records made by a literate society? As I mentioned, the Greenlandic Inuit records talk about encounters with European, which roughly match up with what we get from the Icelandic Annals. Or the Arab traveler bin Khaldun talks about the history of Mali's rise in his Kitab al-Ibar, which matches the Sundiata, our oral tradition from Mali. And so if you have something like that, and you can find two historical events that you can compare the timing of, that is a great way to make sure that the timeline at least roughly matches up. Another one, and it is very cool if you can do it, is there are many historical oral traditions that talk about astronomical events. And the great thing about astronomical events is oftentimes we can actually figure out the day or week or month that it happened. So the indigenous people of Guam talked about a new star that rivaled Venus, and we think this was a supernova recorded by Chinese astronomers in 1054. We have a Buganda tradition in Africa that talks about a great battle between the moon and the sun, which we think was a solar eclipse. Um, and again, reconstructing the record of when solar eclipses happened, which is something we have very high level models for, we think this was 1680. Or similarly, Iroquois tradition talks of, Haudenosaunee is the proper name, but most people know the term Iroquois, mention a total solar eclipse that marked the beginning of the Iroquois Confederacy. And we believe that was either in 1450 or 1142, depending on other factors, which eclipse you think was the eclipse mentioned in the records. Though I will say the thing to consider with this is it is possible that the astronomical event might have been allegorical. So, the sun and the moon falling out of the sky could be symbolic of King Zuko's victory, but it could actually be an eclipse. Likewise, geological evidence. So, tribes in the Pacific Northwest mention tsunamis that match samples taken. If you compare the oral tradition of tsunamis in the Pacific Northwest, not only does it match geological samples, it matches records in Japan, where an earthquake would have caused tsunamis in both directions. And as I mentioned, the Klickitat uh, story about a natural bridge over the Columbian Gorge. So if it talks about geological evidence, this is also something that we can that we can that we can come up with a rough date range uh, based on geology. Oftentimes, archaeological evidence will be your friend. So Hopi records of tribal migrations back up what we find in the archaeological finds about Hopi migration into the Southwest. The Iliad, famously, we have found the historical site of Troy in Hisarlik, Turkey. And we thought that the Iliad was completely fanciful until we found the actual site. Or the Thule, the Proto-Inuit people, migrated to Greenland around 1100. So that means any records we have from the Greenlandic Inuit that take place in Greenland must take place after that about 1100 migration date. Any questions about dating methods? So here's a case study on what coming up with a date for records might look like. So I mentioned the Iroquois tradition claims there was a solar eclipse around when the Confederacy was founded. And we know that's about 1142 or 1451, depending on which eclipse it was. So there is something called the Stick of Enlistment, which has a mark for every Tadarajo, or roughly Speaker of the House, Speaker of the Confederacy. And there are 145 marks on the stick. And so if we average about how long a reign would have been, probabilistically looking at how long people reign in other government types, how long like most kings reign or most presidents live, um, they estimated that it could have started around 1090. And then we have archaeological records showing a rise in walled villages and cannibalism, meaning there was a lot of war going on, a lot of strife, a lot of fighting, and this ended by about the mid 1100s. And therefore, looking at the eclipse, looking at the Stick of Enlistment, looking at the archaeological record, we can say the 1142 date is far more likely than the 1451 date, just given everything else we know about what was going on in the Great Lakes region. Wow, I'm going through this faster than I intended. So, yeah, I'll take another question break. Though this is also a class where there's plenty to chat about once I've gone over the basics. So, from the heraldry angle, let's talk about if you find a name in some sort of the oral tradition, an anthropological record, an epic, um, you know, a genealogy, can you use the name? The first thing is the person talking about an actual person, or are they a personification of some natural force? There is a famous story in Mexico about the two lovers Iztaccíhuatl and Popocatépetl, which are the names of two mountains that are very prominent if you're in the Mexico City area. Now, these names that literally mean white woman and smoking mountain, we believe that those were never real people. There's never real names that people used. This is just a how the mountains got to be just so story. So those would probably not be very usable names. And is the character a demigod or a culture hero? Maui in Polynesian mythology, Cuchulainn in Celtic mythology, Heracles slash Hercules. These we don't think they were real people, or at least there might have been some basis, but they were not real historical figures so much as they were folktales. They were important stories, important figures to tell people, stories about the world they lived in or stories about how they should live their lives. Does it match a pattern that we find in post-period records? So, if you, let's say you find somebody with a name that is based on a flower, and then you look at post-period names and you see evidence of flower-based names, or this particular name even, that is usually a reasonable evidence that this was also used. If you find it post-period, that at least is better evidence it might have been used in period. Also, have there been any large cultural changes that happened between the record and post-period? For instance, you know, did people start adopting Christian names? Did Was there a religious change? Were they conquered by an outside group that imposed their cultural practices? Um, it's useful as sort of a clarifying point or reinforcing point, but of course the data should still stand on its own. Um, Now, in heraldry, we talk about name phrases, the full given name and by name. So, you know, uh, you know, John the Tall, Mary the Baker, names like that. John Black. So not only can you document individual names, you can document the entire phrase from an oral tradition. So if you can find evidence of a by name and a given name, you can use them. If you know how names are constructed post period, you can assume they were probably constructed using similar methods in period, and then you can try to find evidence to document that. Of course, one difficulty you will run into is that a lot of cultures did not have more than one name. The term is monymous. Yeah, so in Nahuatl Aztec culture, most people only had the one name. In a lot of North American indigenous cultures, people are only known by one name. In the SEA, we need at least two names for registration, so we don't get confused what Popocatépetl we're talking about. Um, yeah, so and if you are dealing with a culture like that where there is only one name, there you do have options in heraldry. You can register a group name, for instance. You can be, uh, you can be Popocatépetl of the debatable lands of Carolingia, of Shattered Crystal, of I don't know any groups on the West Coast, but I assume you have groups out there. You get the idea. Stromgard, I think that's one. That sounds like a group in Antir. Also, you can use part of your legal name. Um, that you're always allowed an SAA submission is use part of your legal name. So, things to keep in mind if you're dealing with a culture that only has a tradition of one name. Isma, what did you end up doing with your name when you registered for the second element?
My registered name is Ilvekasiwat de Xochimilco. So of from Xochimilco, which is an island, a portion of Mexico City that is
And
documented to the period. Yeah.
And so for that, you're using what the Spanish were doing, right? Using the
Yes.
de
Yep,
Xochimilco. Yeah.
that is what we're doing. Yeah.
Also, a interesting pattern if you can document it. Some cultures have that sort of synthesis, some don't. So if you are doing a name in these kinds of submissions, information to include is, what is the name? Wow, I cannot speak today. I shouldn't do this after dinner, I swear. Anyways, what name is the culture found in? Is it found in Nahuatl? Is it found in Hadenosani? Is it found in Dine? Is it found in Malian? What is the source that you got the name from? Uh, when and by whom was the source recorded? Do we know about when? We don't need to know the exact date, but saying, about the 1300s or sometime between 1450 and 1575. Just have some range to go off of. And also, what other information do you have that makes you think this name is plausible for existing before 1600? Are we talking archaeological evidence? Are we talking the source mentioned in eclipse? Things like that. I I'm assuming that we don't have any heraldry questions, but correct me if I'm wrong.
I do have one question,
Oh,
if I
please,
can.
please. Yeah.
Yes. I've been actually interested in submitting a name
Okay.
that is before contact
Okay.
for Inca, the Inca civilization,
Mm-hmm.
and is exactly that only one name, um, and is required to have two sources to documentation. I was able to find one, which is the Quechua
Mm-hmm.
dictionary. Um,
Okay.
and the second one is being harder because I found another source, kind of post contact, but the way it was the name that I was interested in was written the way it was,
Okay.
yeah, the way I, the grammar. I cannot speak it
Yes.
right now. The grammar it was used was different, and my family and
Okay.
all of my I have plenty of family and friends also that are in the Peru,
Mm-hmm.
specifically close to the Cusco area, that say the same word and spell the same way, but I don't
Okay.
have a way to document that. So how will you use a second option of documents when you have when I have no other record than the Quechua dictionary, basically? Mhm.
Okay. So the name is found, is the Quechua dictionary modern or is it from time of contact?
This one is a modern Quechua
Okay.
dictionary. Mhm.
Okay. The first thing that I would do is I would see if I know there are some Quechua dictionaries that were made closer to contact by the Spanish. Now spelling is all over the place, but it's worth checking those to see if it's
So,
in a period dictionary. And the in Peru, it's a lot like Mexico, in that contact happened so early that we do have some written records to go off of, even if they're spotty and not very good all of the time. But you do only need one source as long as that source is 100%, we know that we can document it to be for 1650. So we can probably find something. Also, what happened a lot in the Spanish Empire is when people took a Christian name, they took their indigenous name as a second name. So, let's say you were Ocelot in Nahuatl, you got baptized, you become Juan Ocelot or, Pedro Ocelot. So it's possible we might be able to find this name as in in written records, which would be very cool if we can do so. If not, I would look through you know, traditions held by, Quechua speaking people and see if this name shows up or even if that kind of name shows up. If you don't mind me asking, what is the name?
yes, it's what a cat will be in
Hmm,
Quechua, which is
okay.
Michi.
Michi.
Michi, yes, and it's
Okay.
a very used common way of saying cat in Spanish.
Hmm.
and it's a different way of saying. And the second source speaks of one person be have been used that name as well, right after they were doing a census in the
Oh,
first few
really?
censuses. Yes, but the issue in that case is so it was used, but
Okay.
the spelling was different. Instead of Michi, it will sound, but according to Spanish source, more like Misi. And
Misi.
Misi, and no, I've not heard that anywhere in South America that I've been
Yeah.
what the way of pronouncing it is like that. So I've been interested in make sure it's Michi instead of Mitzi, basically.
Okay.
Mhm.
So interesting in Nahuatl, the term is Michtli.
There you go.
So my in-laws are from Mexico, and they're always like, Michi, 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 Michi to the cats. So,
Yes,
if you don't mind, I'll get your email or something after the call, and I'll see if I can find anything to help you with that because I think that would be a very cool name to have.
appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Yep.
Will do.
Any other questions about heraldry, name rec documentation, anything like that? Yes.
So, with my SCA name
Hmm.
Kimani,
Hmm.
um, I've been having a tricky time finding reliable sources in the sense that um, no one has described to me what type of sources I would need as far as like, should it be from like an educational source or should it or can it be like as you're presenting I love this by the way,
Hmm.
as you're presenting it, things that have been passed down and it's just a generalization of that this name existed starting from this century and it's been used ever since.
I think if we could find that the name started being used, at some time before 1600, I don't think it needs to be, academic or scholarly. If we can just find the evidence that supports it. Is there a
Okay.
certain language you're looking at, or rather, what
um
language is Kaimani?
Kimani
Kimani.
is part of the it comes from Africa
Hmm.
and I just blanked. But it started in Kenya
Okay.
before they migrated from um west to east.
Okay. Yeah, I'd say if you can find like oral traditions, if somebody talks about having an ancestor named Kimani, I think it's definitely worth looking into that kind of angle. And there's a lot of I mean, Africa is the land of like very robust oral traditions. So I wouldn't be surprised if you could find something.
Okay, thank you.
Hmm. All right. Anything else? So the second part is if you're trying to document something for A&S, for like an entry, a competition, documentation, and a lot of what we would be talking about in that context is practices. Um, and so this part is about how you try to show that a practice is period, even if we don't have records, like written records from that period. So for practices, the first thing is who demonstrated the practice and who recorded it. Does the practice match what else we have? Does it match artistic depiction? Does it match artifacts? Does it match other oral traditions? And are there any changes to the tools or materials that would make an exact replication difficult or impossible? So and this, so for instance, in the Andes Mountains, we know that clothing was made on what's called a backstrap loom. which is a very basic but very technologically, you know, skilled kind of weaving. And we actually, have records from early in contact of people witnessing backstrap weaving, of doing it, of, we find tools that were used in it in archaeological sites. So, that is something that, and that is something that anybody could make today. Backstrap looms are not that hard to make. And that is a good point. We have a really good class on backstrap weaving in the archives. So, as an example of documenting a period practice, flint knapping, which is, how you make arrowheads and knives and other things out of flint. Now, uh, the the person I'm talking about here, his story is very sad. It's really tragic. It is pretty messed up in a lot of ways. So, if you decide to do further research, um, you have been told. So Ishi was the last member of the Yahi tribe, an indigenous tribe in California. Um, and a, he had lived with his family in a small group in the mountains for 50 years, for most of his life. And in 1911, he left the forest and made contact with broader European American society. Anthropologist T.T. Waterman interviewed him extensively and worked with him closely for several years, recording as much as he could about Ishi's traditional practices, about his culture, about his way of life. Ishi is known as if you'll pardon the term, last of the wild Indians, because he was one of the very last people carrying down these very old traditional practices. And one of the things that we learned from him is it was flint knapping, or at least one of the best ways to do flint knapping. Um, Flint was used all over the world in prehistoric and Neolithic times, but most knowledge of flint knapping had been lost, either as people in Europe and Asia and Africa moved on to other technologies, or during colonization of the Americas. So Ishii had a special technique. Well, Ishii had a technique that he taught that is now known as the Ishii technique, where instead of just taking a stone and hitting it against the flint you're trying to make, you use a stick with a bit of horn or metal or bone on it, um, and you use as kind of a applied pressure, slow pressure over time to nap and make these very sharp arrowhead edges on it. And we actually have pictures of Ishii demonstrating the craft right here. And so this is something that nobody really knew how to do until we know that Ishii taught the technique and had Waterman record the technique, took notes, published them. And this is how we know how to do arrow napping in the traditional Native American way. And so if I was trying to do an ANS entry for flint knapping, I would write something like, these arrowheads were made using the Ishii technique. This technique, using applied pressure applied to the flint with a stick, was originally demonstrated by Ishii of the Yahi tribe in California in 1911 and was recorded by anthropologist T.T. Waterman. This method was recorded in the article Ishii, Last of the Yahi Indians, 1917. I would include a link to the Google Books of the article. I would make sure it matches however documentation is done in your kingdom, and this is something that every kingdom does differently, and even within the kingdom, people teach classes on. So this is just sort of an overview of what information they would want to see. And that is my class. So what other questions do people have? What what was something that people found cool?
That's hard to be specific because it was a really great class.
I'm glad to hear that. And there's a lot of work that can still be done on this. Like I've said, this is just The SCA came out with that directive on oral traditions, and as a herald, I thought, how can I apply this to what I do? And how can we make sure that people from various indigenous backgrounds, wherever and wherever and whatever that background is, how can we make sure that they can do cool stuff based on their backgrounds? Yes, Genevieve?
All right, finally off mute. Thank you for your patience.
Yep.
A couple of years ago, I listened to a lecture from some folks who were themselves First Nations,
Hmm.
and they were exploring their culture within an SCA context. And they
Okay.
had the opportunity to speak with their elders and learn ANS, I'm going to say ANS stuff from their elders, and they were applying what they had learned within an SCA context. And so that happened before the oral directions came out from the BOD.
Hmm.
When I read the oral directions, when I read the instructions from the BOD, I just was concerned. It sounded like, you know, these people, if they were going to like be on the laurel path or do ANS, they were still required to have something written documentation. And I'm a laurel myself, and I
Hmm.
want to be open to understanding how to approach folks that are on the laurel path. And still, it just seems like a contradiction that people are still being held to this written documentation. Am I making any sense here?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
So if I understand you right, let's say sticking with my flint knapping example that I used. So let's say I enter my custom-made arrowheads in an ANS, and you're going by the metrics, and it sounds like there is the expectation, and probably unfairly, but that I would have some sort of written period source on arrowhead creation. Is
So,
is that what you're
I
saying,
think,
or
well, I am, but in cases where there isn't, there really isn't, I mean, I'm not an expert in this field by any stretch of the
hmm.
imagination. I just want to understand how I can be better. Um, so let's say it's clothing, pre
Okay. Yeah.
1600 clothing, and that I'm guessing really hasn't survived very much in the archaeological record. But they, hypothetically here, let's say you have a First Nations goes talks to an elder and they talk about clothing, making this up, people.
Hmm.
And but there's no archaeological evidence. All they have is an oral tradition. And it just seems like they're still being required to, you see what I'm saying? I'm really struggling with this. To prove that something is to prove something is within our SCA period from oral traditions,
Hmm.
if there isn't some, Western archaeologist who wrote it up,
Hmm.
or it didn't survive in the archaeological record, or there wasn't, um, you know, colonizers or whatever came in and they just destroyed everything and didn't record anything. So I'm not knowledgeable in this area, but
Hmm.
it seems like they're being held to an impossible standard.
And I mean, to some extent they are. I mean, that's just the long and short of it is it is very difficult. It's difficult to prove something that it's tough to prove something without that kind of evidence. But if I may use an example, in the Iliad, which, as I've mentioned, was recorded several hundred years after it took place, we have evidence um, of Ajax the Greater fighting with a sword and uh, like a giant shield style that nobody in classical Greece used. And it turns out that that was actually a way that people fought in the pre-classical, pre-Homeric era that was passed down. So if I was wanted to prove that people wore a certain kind of dress, and the word for that dress was huipil, to use an example from Nahuatl, and there are stories or legends that talk about people wearing huipils and that go that we are reasonably sure date to period. Now, do I know that a huipil today means the exact same thing as a huipil in 1500? No. But I know the word means dress, and I know that it was interpreted to mean the same kind of dress. And you know, I would say that people should be given the benefit of the doubt that that kind of, that if the word is there, that it probably refers to close enough to the same thing that we can assume that it was used. I would also say that for a piece of clothing, the technique, if they're making it, the technique is probably as important as what they make itself. If they're doing it on a backstrap loom, for instance, that is a pretty impressive traditional craft, even if what they made might not be exactly the same as people wore in 1500.
All right. Well, thank you. It's something
Mhm.
I'm still thinking about, but thank you for your
Uh,
answer.
I don't have all the answers either. I hope it was helpful at all, but it's a good question. So Tala added, this is a good question. The Tuaregs in the Sahel have a robust oral history that includes history and names. Some of these stories' names have only recently been written down, if at all. If I talk to a Tuareg person, can I cite them without using a written source as well? Now keep in mind, I am not the Herald Laurel King of Arms. So it's not my final call, but my interpretation would be, um, if a Tuareg person, if he just says that, I had an ancestor with this name, that by itself I wouldn't consider sufficient. But if they say this person, based on this oral genealogy, was my 15 times great grandfather, this was his name, I would consider that likely to be valid, at least based on other similar kinds of like genealogy name searches we've seen in places like Africa and Indonesia. Does that make sense?
It does, thank you. And actually, you got me thinking as well about some of the Afro-Asiatic languages. I have a linguistics background, so
Hmm.
it occurred to me that kind of going off what you were saying, that would be a good idea to, because a lot of these languages, are related in some way, and just looking for a word that is similar. So I just to understand, like that's something that I could definitely do, like compare I study Afro-Asiatic languages. So
Okay.
to like if there was like a Tuareg name and I found like another Afro-Asiatic language that had like a Tamazight, North African Amazigh
Hmm.
word that was very similar, or even like a like yeah, from one of the other regions around the Sahel. I mean, could I use that then as well? Like here is another word that means the same, or name that means the same thing from a brother or sister language. Like how would that play in? Would that count as another case of precedence, or would that just what would that look like?
I would consider that to be supporting evidence. I would
Okay.
consider that to be, I would look at it as you're making an argument, like a legal argument,
Mm-hmm.
and that is supporting evidence. And that is something, in Indo-European languages, we have the name the name Euclid in Greek means good fame. But we also have the name Khosrow in Persian, which is a related language that also means good fame. And we have similar names in a lot of the Indo-European languages that all mean the same thing and all come from the same roots if you trace it back. So I would consider that to be at least supporting evidence, especially if you have three sister languages that all have the same name. I assume the fourth one probably has it either through a loan or through parallel transmission.
Thank you.
All right. Anyone have anything else? Well, thank you all for attending. This is fun. It was good to break this off, to brush this off and teach it again. Yzma, thank you for hosting. And what did you say next month's classes? And you're
I'm so
muted.
sorry I
Yeah.
was muted, but I am coming back. I am here. All right. So our next class is on August the 5th, which is, I think, a Tuesday. It's a Tuesday, August 5th. It is at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, and it is on the history of horses in North, Central, and South America. It will be taught at 7. It will be recorded. Really excited about this. This is a new class for us with a new instructor that we've never had before. So I'm really excited to have you guys here. As always, one of the things that I want to just end with, whenever we get into a discussion of people being held to an impossible standard within the SCA, I always just want to invite those with high positions in our society, people with platforms, people who have elected positions in our society. If you see someone doing Indigenous work or Indigenous personas, Indigenous research, and you feel that they are being held to an unfair standard, it is also your place to stand up for them and to continue to do so. If you see someone trying to do something unique and different in your kingdom or in your group, you can speak up for them. You can give them a voice. Um, and you can make changes, even small changes within your own kingdom and local groups. You do not have to wait for permission to just do something kind for people who are trying to expand the horizons of what the SCA can include. So I want to thank everybody, especially who has those positions or who has that voice within the society, who comes to these types of events and who thinks about these things. I want to thank you again for doing so and for continuing to make space for those of us who are doing this kind of research and this kind of work in your SCA practice, as well as making space for us in your kingdom. So thank you so much. And I'm going to turn off the recording now. If you guys want to hang out for a few more minutes, I'm happy to leave the Zoom call up. Otherwise, this recording should be up within the next week or so that you guys can review it on time. Thanks again.